So I'll talk a little bit about some of the work which we're doing at the OECD on measuring the new economy, and also probably touch on a number of the other speakers and what they've been talking about. I don't think we need to say too much about why this all matters. I think there's a lot of policy issues in this area, including the impacts we see on economy and society. And I agree with the previous speaker that basically I think the impacts on society are very important as well. And if we want to understand this, then I think we need to do a lot more work on measurement. There are quite a lot of challenges. I just did a little, we've heard Bob Solow in the 80s. Now I think we have probably a similar situation. We see a lot of digital technology. We don't see it very clearly in productivity. And I know other speakers will talk about that as well. I think it is difficult partly because we see a lot of very rapid change in this area, which means that measurement often lags. It is hard to keep up sometimes with some things. And also, I think there is an issue that the implementation of some of these issues can be quite costly and difficult. There is a lot happening, and I didn't want to start from the macro perspective. I'll come back to that a little bit later. I do think it's important to say as well, we need a micro underpinning. We need to understand what's happening at the firm level. We need to understand what's happening at the level of households. And there is a lot happening there. So I think, for instance, this is from some of the work we've been doing for a number of OECD countries, and where you can see that the number of firms, large firms, small firms that are using big data analysis a few years ago. And I think what we typically find there, that some of these technologies haven't spread quite as widely as we sometimes think they have. So basically, there's still a big gap in the fusion of these technologies in many cases. And that's something we also see if we think about the productivity story and we bring it back to a micro level, that there are very big differences between firms in the productivity dimension. So we don't see a lot of activity at the aggregate level. We don't see digital technology being reflected at the aggregate level very clearly. We do see, I think, at the micro level that some firms are turning these technology into productivity growth, but the number of firms that's doing that is not really large enough yet to turn that into an aggregate story as well. So I think there are differences here, and we see very clear divergence in productivity between the superstar firms and many others in terms of what's happening in the economy. I think the other thing is, I think we also need to look at the household level, and I think particularly if we want to understand impacts from at the level of people, and individuals, and society. This is from the report which you just mentioned, which we did for the G20 this year, just looking at how some tools are being used in different countries. I think gives us some insights on where we are in different countries in the diffusion of this technology and what's happening. So there is a lot. We've many indicators on infrastructure, on innovation, on society, on jobs and growth. There's a lot happening. We have a lot of these indicators ourselves available for many countries on our Going Digital toolkit. So there's a lot of information, and the first speaker, Michael Spence, already mentioned that as well. I mean, I think there is a lot available that we can draw on. However, there are a couple of big challenges, I think, and I wanted to just touch on a few of them, also coming in from a more of a policy perspective. I think first that the digital economy is still not very visible in economic statistics. So we still have difficulties understanding what this is really about. What do we really mean by it? And I want to say a few words in a second about some of the work which we did on definitions this year. And also, I think what is going on in many countries on better developing supply use tables, satellite accounts to really capture the digital economy much better. There are also, I think, some impacts that are very hard to measure on productivity, of course, on jobs, on well-being. I think Eric Nelson will, of course, talk about zero pricing of certain digital services, which is an issue. So there are some impacts which are very hard to get at. I think also on the labor market side, it's still tough. There's a lot of discussion about what this is really doing to the labor market. We know that some jobs are going to be lost, some new jobs are being created. A lot of will mean that we need to see a shift in the labor market from those jobs that are declining to jobs that are growing. And the big issue there is typically skills. How do we make sure that people get the new skills for the new jobs that are being required? And there, again, there is a measurement issue that we're looking at. Fourth issue I wanted to mention here, because I think it's very crucial as well, and something we did some work on this year, on data and data flows. Data, I think, is a really important asset in this digital economy. A lot of policy discussion going on about data, sharing of data, access to data. data flow. So this is again an area where measurement is still a problem. Fifth issue is really around the diffusion of these technologies. If we do think we want to see impacts at the firm level and then ultimately at the industry level and the economy-wide level, a lot of this has to do as well about how these technologies are diffusing across the economy and how new technologies are being picked up and firms are being used. So I think there again, still gaps in terms of what is being done. And final issue here is, I think, and Michael Spence touched on this as well, is the issue of trust. Things like digital security, privacy as well, there's not that much that we have on that. The difficulties I think we have is still, and I mentioned that already, statistical systems. So the national statistical offices in many countries have difficulties responding quickly to the rapid changes that we're seeing in this new economy. Also, I think the other issue is that in many countries, we do have good studies, we have good data, we have good methodologies that exist, that have been tested in many countries, but the diffusion of these methodologies and ways of doing things across countries is still quite patchy. So we have, we have statistics that are being developed in China, in the United States, in Europe, but they're not necessarily comparable. They're doing things in a slightly different way, which means also that it's hard to really look across countries. So those are a couple of, I think, issues that are there that we need to work on. They also, I think, affect how we look at the macro story. Now, one of the things we did this year was, in our work for the G20, was doing a little bit of work on defining the digital economy. Now, this has been going on for a very long time. We were working on developing measuring the ICT sector already in the 90s. There have been variations for quite a long time. Mostly, I think we know it's a bit fuzzy. There are some boundaries that are not very clear. I think we have two approaches. Typically, we have a bottom-up approach where we basically look at different sectors. We look at sometimes at certain products. We try to build it up from there to a more aggregate story, to some sort of definition of digital economy. And we have top-down definitions where we basically talk about the platform economy or other types of things where we basically come down from that perspective. Those are more difficult. They are more subjective. They're also more difficult to get agreement on internationally. What we tried to do is come up with a definition that was agreed to by G20 countries in July. We did a lot of work as well with international organizations. I saw Marshall Reinsdorf from the IMF was on the call. I think he was one of the people involved in this discussion. So we agreed on a definition. I'll come back to this in a second. And the idea is really that we have a definition that has different tiers. It has different levels with different elements, so we can that are complementary and that can help us build a perspective on the digital economy. They're all based on existing concepts, on existing things that exist already also developed in international organizations. And we also included a final tier, which was really on the digital society, very closely to what I think William Nelson will talk about in a second. So what we have there is this more perspective of four different elements. So one is the core, which is very much the ICT producing sector. This has been around for a very long time. We have a narrow digital economy where you basically have producers as well that are very much reliant on digital technologies and on data. So think here, for instance, about some of the platforms that are operating. If you basically wouldn't be using digital technology, you wouldn't have a business model. So you have Netflix there, you have Uber, you have lots of the, also I think Chinese platforms would be there. They are not necessarily producers of ICT technologies, but they're completely reliant on digital technologies for their business model. And then we have a broader definition where we would basically be going into firms that rely heavily, that are enhanced, where the economic activity is enhanced by technologies and data. And that's, of course, where you get more difficulties in the boundaries. And finally, you have a part which is digital society, where you also go into other activities, not necessarily economics, that are also being enhanced by digital technologies, where you get into the societal aspect of things. So I think this is one way of trying to think about this. We are doing a lot of work at the international level on macroeconomic statistics, trying to respond to the issues here. There's an advisory group on measuring GDP and the digital economy at the OECD, working with different international organizations. We developed a framework for digital supply use tables. Last year, we're doing a lot of work on digital trade. So there is a lot of activity to try and move forward on these issues and to try and reach agreement. And there's also a lot of work with other international organizations that are trying to move this agenda forward, because we need to move together on these issues to try and make sure we move ahead. There are challenges here. This is just one example on price measurement, where we see, even though, you know, if you talk about ICT products, you think about prices going down. You see here that there are very big differences in a sector where, for instance, Australia and France had declining prices for ICT equipment over the period 2010, 2015, whereas the UK, they were going up. So is this a reality, or is this basically methodologies that are different that affect how we look at it? So I don't want to take you any further. We have a lot of information which I can share with you. This is why I put these sort of more advertising slides in it, so you can basically find some of the material. There's a lot going on, a lot more that we need to do. But I think also progress that is slowly being made to try and sort of move the boundaries forward. And finally, I wanted to mention this toolkit again, also because it's fun. You can basically compare your own country in a very dynamic way and have a look at that. So let me end there, and looking forward to the discussion a bit later. Thanks.